Happy Wednesday, everyone. We are back with another Portage webinar, this time on RDM and Metadata for Discovery, What's in it for Researchers? My name is Jennifer Abel. I am the training coordinator for NREO Portage. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land that I'm speaking to you from is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. Today, we are going to be hearing about the following. In the past 5 years, researchers have seen a growing number of research data management policies being implemented by funders, publishers, and institutions. One key element in meeting these requirements, particularly in terms of data discovery, is using metadata, which helps make research data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, also known as the FAIR principles. This session will reveal the secret life of your dataset metadata, the ways in which for many years to come, it will work nonstop to foster the visibility, research, and impact of your work. Join us, as you have done, to see how metadata will help your dataset travel through the global research infrastructure and how data repositories and discovery services can use this metadata to help launch your dataset into the world. It's going to be good stuff. Couple things before we get started. You have been muted automatically when you entered the room. This webinar is being recorded and the chat may be archived for those who are unable to attend. We encourage you to use the latest version of Zoom so that you have access to all of the features, including security updates. But if you're already here, you don't have to update right now. Please use the chat feature if you're having technical difficulties or have additional resources to share. And please use the Q&A option to ask questions of our presenters. Questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. You can also raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and you can ask your questions in English or in French. We are being hosted in the Carl webinar room. Carl and the Portage Network are committed to providing a welcoming, safe, and harassment-free environment for its staff, membership, committees, and working groups, as well as for participants, speakers, and organizers of Carl meetings and events. We don't tolerate harassment of any kind. Our presenters today, we have Alicia Urquidy-Diaz, who is a research associate with the International Technology Office of World Data System. Alicia has worked there since 2019, where she's been involved in identifying and describing networks of metadata syndication within emerging global digital research infrastructures. She's currently supporting ITO's leadership in the Research Data Alliance's Global Open Research Commons International Benchmarking Working Group, which is a very long name. Alicia is a member of Portage's Discovery and Metadata Experts Group and participates in both the Further Discovery Service Working Group and the Canadian Data Repository Landscape Working Group. And we also have Kelly Stathis, and I spelled your name wrong, Kelly, and I apologize. There should be an extra T in there. Kelly is my colleague here at Portage, is our Discovery and Metadata Coordinator, and advances discovery and metadata initiatives for Further and provides technical support for the Data Canada Consortium and works with several Portage expert and working groups. They're a member of the Discovery and Metadata Expert Group, the Data Repositories Expert Group, and the Dataverse North Metadata Working Group, and serve as co-chair of the Further Discovery Redesign Working Group. Two very busy people. We are very glad to have them here today. And with that, Alicia, the virtual and pixelated floor is yours.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you everybody also from me for being here. I'm about to share my screen with you. Here we go. I hope you can see that. Could you kind of confirm for me, Jen, that that's working? I'm seeing all good. Okay, great. Thank you. So again, thank you for being here. To start, I would like to acknowledge with respect that I'm a settler living in James Bay, Victoria, BC, a traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people who are known today as the Songhees Nation. To this day, the Songhees, Eskimos, and Saanich people still maintain relationships with the land occupied by the City and University of Victoria, which is also the case for the Musqueam and Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations in Vancouver, from which Kelly is presenting to us today, and which are traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of these people. And we know how lucky we are to be in this beautiful part of the world, which has been cared for by First Nations since the beginning of history, or since before European history, written history began. If you'd like to acknowledge the land you're coming to us from today, please feel welcome to write it in the chat. We won't be able to address it during the session, but we will be able to see it. Thank you for that in advance. So today's webinar, all about the secret lives of your syndicated metadata. I'll begin by introducing the issues involved in today's topic, namely metadata as it relates to discovery. Why should it matter to you as researchers, and what discovery infrastructures can accomplish when you pay good attention to RDM? For an example of a discovery infrastructure, we're lucky to have Kelly Status from NPO Portage speaking about the Further Discovery Service, giving us a peek into its inner workings. And finally, we will look at an example data set that will help illustrate our recommendations. We will call them tips in a way that we hope will make sense to you. So, Jen, do you have those audience results?
I'm just going to launch it right now.
Okay, great. So I'd like you to please answer a quick question about what your role is right now at the institution that you work or research in, so we can know a little bit about who's with us in the audience.
Well, we're getting a good response. We'll give another few seconds. We might actually get everybody on this one.
Oh, wow. Impressive. If you are under the category other, also feel free to share that on the chat so we can see you be represented as well.
I think maybe we've stalled out. I was hoping for 100% voter turnout, but not this time.
Pretty sure it's great. I think.
Okay, I think we will end it there.
Okay, predominantly librarians, 22% academic research, our target audience. That is good to see. Data managers, some too, and others. Let's see. Consulting with faculty on data management plans. This is Connor. I hope I pronounced that right. Okay, that's excellent. Well, I'm glad to see that we have choppy. Oh,
I think maybe you're actually just stopping a bit. So.
Well, thank you for responding, and welcome everybody. I hope that this webinar will speak to you in some way at least. So I would like to go right on to the next poll and last one, I promise, because I'd like to begin also by getting a sense of what you're thinking about and what metadata for discovery or metadata and discovery means to you. So please take a minute right now to go to Mentimeter by clicking on this link, which Jen has also shared in the chat, or you can also use the QR code on the screen if it's easier. And please answer one question. What do you associate with the concept of metadata and discovery? And while you do that, let me tell you a bit about the work I do and why I'm here speaking to you today. The World Data System is an international consortium of research data repositories where my office, ITO, works primarily with repository managers on technical issues or technical questions such as metadata sharing, with support from the Canadian agency NDRIO. And because of this, most of ITO's public resources are designed with that audience in mind, research data repositories. Part of our work is also in collaboration with Portage's Discovery and Metadata Expert Group, the DMAG, where this webinar was conceived, as many of the lessons that ITO has learned are also important things that researchers should know about, we think. So in that sense, I'd also like to acknowledge the DMAG as co-creators of this webinar, including Kelly, as well as my own co-workers at WDS ITO, Chantel Very and ITO Director Karen Payne, who've been co-created a lot of the content in this presentation as well. Now, I would take you to these results and see Okay. Oh, nice. Okay, description, data about data, standards. Good. Yes, you're covering exactly. Sharing, interoperability, findability. So familiarity with the FAIR principles is there. Data reuse, that's very important. Keywords, reuse. Okay, yeah. This is lovely. Standards, okay, sharing changed now. Okay, fantastic. Thank you for your answers. That's I'm glad that you have thought about this clearly, and we can start on a good foot. Present again. So to begin in very general terms, as you know, data discovery is the ability to derive or discover new information and knowledge from existing data sources. That's one definition also from Prakash. Then we have metadata, or data about data, or the information we create, store, and share to describe things among these research datasets, which allow us to interact with these things to obtain the knowledge we need. There are many different kinds of metadata, but today we're focusing on one type, namely descriptive metadata. This is information whose purpose is to facilitate the discovery of resources, or to provide contextual information useful in the understanding or interpretation of a resource. Whereas metadata for discovery is also a common term that is most often used to refer to a standardized, very basic and general abstract set of core descriptive elements or fields in metadata. As you know, Dublin Core is one example of this, or the main example of this. And these are also established criteria that organize some information objects of any kind. But any fields that promote discovery are also promoting reuse, as we will see later on in the presentation. Because in practical terms, discovery enables reuse, and reuse is ultimately what many researchers are after. Metadata works as a systematic description of your data that others, people and machines, can interpret to make sense of the contents, and to know how to work with the contents of your dataset for good scholarship. As more digital tools and software for data analysis and visualization rely on metadata for advanced functionality, it's important to keep in mind that the richer your metadata, the more likely it is that your dataset will be found by people, and increasingly by specialized software and specialized machines. The technologies, mechanisms, and practices that are necessary to make data discoverable involve standards for data and for metadata, standardized practices for data, normalization, preservation, as well as tools and technologies to exchange and query metadata, to connect information and make it accessible for reuse. Throughout the data lifecycle, data discovery and reuse is made possible by the actions of many different agents, not least of all researchers. So the remainder of today's session will focus on these three factors: researchers, metadata, and data discovery infrastructures, and the role that each can play in making datasets discoverable. As for the latter, discovery infrastructures can be described as entities that do the combined work of aggregating metadata from different providers, organizing and indexing it, and harmonizing metadata records, or depending on the approach, the queries themselves, so that they can be browsed and queried by people and machines. Although data and metadata can enter a discovery system in different ways, a typical workflow involves researchers depositing a data set along with its metadata in a repository, which can be specialized for their area of research, or institutional, like a Dataverse, which you might be familiar with. Then the repository provides the metadata to aggregation services, which process and then share the metadata through their own discovery interfaces. From these, the metadata records can be accessed by human users, but they can also be harvested by still other aggregators and travel far and wide through a global federated network of digital research infrastructures to be found again by users to search for information, such as yourself, perhaps. So this
Alicia,
point,
would you be able to turn up your mic volume a little bit?
oh yes, I'm sorry about that. Does that help?
I think so, yeah.
Let me just go to the settings just to get it out of the. Let me know if it's
Okay.
Yeah, if it
Thank
continues.
you.
Okay, so at this point, I wanted to introduce Kelly, who will give us an insider look at what happens when Further harvests your metadata.
Thanks, Alicia. I'm just going to share my screen here. Just one moment. Is it looking okay for everyone? Yeah, cool. All right. Yeah, thanks for having me as part of this webinar today. I'm Kelly Stathis. I am the Discovery and Metadata Coordinator for the Portage Network. And I'm here to give an overview of the Further Discovery Service. So what it is, how it benefits researchers, and how it works to bring together metadata from different data repositories into a single search platform. So the Federated Research Data Repository, or FRDR, is a scalable federated platform for research data management and the discovery of Canadian research data. We are a collaboration between NGO's Portage Network and Compute Canada. One of FRDR's services is the FRDR Discovery Service, and this is a national discovery layer which provides a single point of search for Canadian research data. FRDR also offers data deposit and preservation services, which you may be familiar with, but this presentation will focus on the discovery service. So the FRDR Discovery Service provides functionality to discover datasets from Canadian research data repositories from any discipline. So essentially, we are harvesting metadata from multiple types of repository platforms, and we expose that metadata through that single point of search, a centralized metadata catalog. Currently, FRDR has just over 120,000 datasets that are aggregated from over 80 repositories. And there are a few different components to this part of the platform. There's the metadata harvester itself. This is a Python script that's harvesting the metadata from different repositories. It writes it to a database and then exports that in a format that we use for indexing. There's our search functionality, which is built using Globus Search. And then there's our discovery interface, which is based on UBC Libraries Open Collections. That's the one shown on the right there. FRDR's National Discovery Layer has several benefits for researchers. First, FRDR's improving discovery of Canadian research data by making metadata discoverable in that single search interface. This helps to break down repository silos. So instead of having to search multiple locations, a researcher can use FRDR to search across all the repositories that we harvest. FRDR also benefits data repositories by driving traffic back to them, because each search result in FRDR will link back to that original data source. And then finally, we're able to use the index that we've created to provide harvested metadata to other aggregators using our OAI PMH metadata feed. And this helps to promote interoperability between Canadian and international platforms. These aggregators include the Open Air Research Graph, the Data Citation Index, so that's part of the Web of Science, and also ProQuest Central Discovery Index, which is used by many academic libraries. So here's a brief overview of what data is discoverable in FRDR. So currently we have over 80 research data repositories, and these include university repositories, government repositories, various domain-specific repositories, as well as datasets that are directly deposited in FRDR's own repository service. So just to give a couple examples here, university repositories would include, we have all of Scholars Portal dataverses, as well as several institutional repositories. And for institutional repositories that include a mix of different types of research output, so datasets, publications, theses, we'll just filter out the datasets from those for inclusion in FRDR. We also harvest government repositories. We've got the Federal Open Government Portal data in FRDR, as well as most provincial data portals and a growing number of local and municipal data portals. Domain-specific repositories in FRDR include data repositories from several different research centers, including DataStream and CEUS, the Canadian Integrated Ocean Observing System. And then finally, we have the over 200 datasets that are published directly in FRDR's own repository, and those are also accessible via the same discovery interface. So I'm going to go through an example here of how Further aggregates metadata for discovery. And I've chosen an example from UBC Dataverse. Further harvests UBC Dataverse, and that's one of the Scholars Portal dataverses. We can use this example to see how Further then makes data available for discovery in various different places. So I'd like to first draw attention to the descriptive metadata that was included with this data set. So when depositing in UBC Dataverse, the researcher included robust metadata here, including a detailed description. They have keyword terms, they have an ORCID ID, and they also have geospatial metadata, including 2 place names and a bounding box that you can see at the bottom there. So then once this data set was published in UBC Dataverse, it was picked up by the Further metadata harvester. And this harvester has different procedures for each protocol or API type. So there's one specific to Dataverse, there's one for CCAN, OAI-PMH, and several others. And I won't go into much detail on that today, but I've got the link to the GitHub repository on this slide. And so once Further has done an initial harvest for a given repository to retrieve all of the metadata records, we will fetch new records from that repository every week. So if you're publishing a data set in one of Further's harvested repositories, that data set's metadata should be available in Further within 7 days. So now I'm going to look at how the data set appears in Further's main text-based discovery interface. So this interface allows for basic keyword searching and has support for both English and French. And so once you've started a search, you can also you can filter results by different metadata elements, including the date, author, and the source repository. So here we can see that a search for some key terms, I put in burn severity, British Columbia, turned up that same data set from UBC Dataverse, along with some other results that are related to this topic. And so to see the details of any results, you can click on show details for anyone. And then this view will show the harvested metadata that we retrieved from the source repository, in this case, UBC Dataverse, which was then mapped to Further's metadata schema with the elements that are shown there. I should note that the title for each result here will link back to the datasets landing page in the source repository. In addition to text-based discovery, Further provides a service for geospatial data discovery called Geodesy. Geodesy is a platform for map-based search, which was developed at UBC Library. And Geodesy is now connected to the same database that the Further harvester uses. However, it only includes a subset of the records that you will find in the text-based discovery interface. And those are the data sets that have geospatial information, which can be shown on a map-based search. So Geodesy, how it works is it's processing geospatial metadata as well as data sets that include any geospatial files associated with them. So in order to attribute a location to a data set, Geodesy uses any explicit coordinates found in the dataset's metadata. So that could be the bounding box, like shown in the example, or it could be a shapefile. And also for repositories that have detailed place name metadata, so Dataverse is one of these, Geodesy can analyze those place names and then it queries a service called GeoNames to get the corresponding coordinates. And this way, a data set can appear on the map, even if it doesn't otherwise have explicit coordinates in the metadata or files. So in order to search for data sets in Geodesy, users can use the map to create a bounding box and then retrieve data sets that have coordinates within that selected location. So in this example, I searched for burn severity. Instead of putting British Columbia in the text box, I created a bounding box roughly here around Prince George, BC, and then retrieved our example data set. And this is possible because of that geospatial metadata that the depositor provided. So they had here those place names and the bounding box, which Geodesy was able to utilize. In addition to the text-based and geospatial search capabilities, Further is also sharing the harvested metadata with other aggregators. And we do this with OAI-PMH, which is a protocol used to provide an XML metadata feed for harvesting. So using OAI-PMH, Further packages all the metadata records from the repositories that we harvest, and then use the package so that they can all be harvested at once by other harvesters. One aggregator that uses the Further's OAI-PMH feed is the Open Air Research Graph. And this is an EU project that pulls together one of the largest open access collections of research outputs. here we can see that searching in OpenAir for the same key terms shows that same data set in the results. And then when you click through on the result, OpenAir also provides a landing page for each record with basic metadata. So here in the summary section, you can see it has the dataset description, DOI, and the keywords. And then on the right side, there's an indication that that OpenAir retrieved metadata from Furter for this dataset. So just to wrap up with the big picture, so we've seen how after being published in UBC Dataverse, this dataset was made more broadly available for discovery by Furter. So once it was picked up by the Furter's metadata harvester, the dataset's metadata was stored in Furter's database. And from there, it was made available in Furter's text-based search platform and Geodesy, the map-based search platform, to Canadian discovery portals. And then additionally, through that OAI PMH feed, the metadata was made discoverable in other aggregators internationally, as we saw with the OpenAir example. Now I'm going to pass it back to Alicia to go over some of the tips for improving data discovery and metadata.
Thank you, Kelly. Thanks again. I'm back with headset. Could please, Jane and Brenda, confirm that you can hear me now, and anybody else who's having issues? If you can just put it in the chat or otherwise make a sign. Otherwise, I'll just continue onto our presentation. So to get started with the tips, it would be useful to have a concrete example, as talking about metadata can be so abstract. So I'd like you to please go to one of the platforms that's listed on the slide, links of which Jen will share with you through the chat. Oh, it's the same as before. I'm not sure what I can do about that. I'm really sorry. Let's see.
I think it might just be how you speak, Alicia. You have a lot of pauses.
I do have a lot of pauses. I apologize for that. I will try to be more fluent. Jen, could you please share those links with people on the...
They are in the chat.
Are they in the chat? Oh, I was looking at the Q&A. Thank you. Good. So if you go to one of them or two, how many you have time to, and do a keyword search for earthquake monitoring Vancouver Island, please. I'll give you all a second to load the page and enter the keywords. The target data set will be the first or second result in any of these platforms. And ideally, you can find the data set through the keyword search at one of these sites so you can get the full discovery experience, although most of you are librarians. So, but still, humor me. And before I share the next slide, please find the data set that is formatted as a table. So it indicates that it's a table. And it has people named Martin among its co-authors. Oh, sorry, it's Earthquake Monitoring Vancouver Island. I will put it here in the chat as well. There we go. All right, so I'm hoping everybody's there. And both Martins, this is the data set I want for you to find. It contains the citation for this data set with a DOI link that takes you to the landing page of Pangea. Below on the slide, you will find a link to the metadata record formatted as JSON-LD, which is a metadata markup format. It only really renders nicely if you're using Firefox, perhaps another browser, but it can also be viewed as plain code in Google Chrome. So this is the example data set. As you can see, it's an earth science data set, namely about earthquake monitoring, and it is also related to ocean observation, and it is from around Vancouver Island. Each of these discovery platforms is currently sharing metadata for this data set, which they got from Pangea, the Earth and Environmental Science Repository, where this data set was deposited. But because Pangea also created DOIs for data records through DataSite, a few of these aggregation services received 2 copies of the metadata. One copy through Pangea directly and another through DataSite. So in total, access to this data set, as far as I could find, is mediated through at least 6 different international search platforms, and potentially more, as the metadata records can always be harvested by still others, as Kelly has shown us, and I've also echoed. About those duplicate records, from the Pangea repository and from DataSite, let's look at how Google Dataset Search and OpenAIRE have dealt with this duplication in different ways. Google Dataset Search interprets the separate metadata sources as different datasets, whereas OpenAIRE merges all duplicate metadata entries into one central record. This is useful because it makes it clear to users that while they may find multiple access points to your dataset, there's only really one true record. In this case, the one at the source repository, which also happens to host the dataset for download. This is where tip number one comes in: DOIs, unique persistent identifiers that allow your dataset's main site, its landing page, to be found, referred to, and linked unambiguously. By making your dataset unique, DOIs also help your data be cited in a way that makes it easier to track how many times it has been cited. And by the way, there is, which you might be aware of, an ongoing collaboration with DataSet through the Portage Network and CRCAN, which means that DataSet is minting a lot of Canada's DOIs, which may be too much information, but we still thought it was worth mentioning because it means Canadian repositories will also be using more DOIs towards the future. Tip number two relates to identifiers as well, maybe unique identifiers for researchers and contributors, such as ORCIDs, which in Pangea you can view when you hover over authors' names, but only those who have provided them. These are 3 unique identifiers that researchers can create and manage themselves, and that machines can harvest and use to link the right work to the right authors, or provide linkage between one piece of work and others that you have created, alone or in collaboration. Increasingly, ORCIDs are also being used to track contributions to different kinds of academic work, such as peer review activities. Now you can get credit for the reviews that you give, successful grants, presentations, and so on. So using ORCIDs, your work is more discoverable and can be more accurately referred to. Tip number 3, access and rights metadata. I'm conflating the two here for the sake of brevity, but it's essentially the information that users need to know about conditions. Conditions for access, how to get a copy of your data, or even if it is possible to do so, and if so, how. Data may exist that can be openly distributed, but it still makes sense to share its existence. And also conditions to use, limitations to how the data can be used, and instructions on how to give proper attribution so that all rights are respected as intended. There are different kinds of licenses for research data and different access modes, and your decision can be based on many factors. Whichever ones you make, though, providing access statements and using machine-readable licenses and in metadata lets discovery services filter accordingly, as well as letting users know how to use it. Going into the different kinds of licenses and access modes is beyond the scope of this webinar, but I would specifically for access like to point that it's important to be aware of different types of data that can need different approaches to access. According to the FAIR principles, fair data should be as open as possible, but as close as necessary. So my next tip is to make yourself acquainted with the data governance rights of Indigenous nations. Indigenous data sovereignty as an orientation or as a discourse raises many fundamental questions about data rights that go beyond the scope of Indigenous communities, that take care of those, but go beyond as well into open data communities as a whole. So I urge you to please review and consider them and how they may apply to your research and the data that you work. Tip number 4 builds upon Kelly's Geodesy presentation, the discovery role of spatial metadata. So I will be brief. Please just note how the rich coverage and event metadata provided in our example dataset lets you visualize on the Pangea platform all the different steps of the journey on the map, of the journey that created this dataset. This is only because it includes the location and the times where the research expedition started, ended, and had different milestones. So up until now, all the descriptive elements we've referred to are fairly general, and they probably can apply to the majority of data sets. But in many cases, it will also be of value to add more detail for specific research areas of kinds of data. all kinds of data. And it's sometimes hard to see clearly when you're in the thick of it and so close to your work. But so many specific and unspoken assumptions underlie research work. For that, metadata offers us a systematic way of making those assumptions explicit, documenting your data so others can reuse it properly. The more explicit, the more likely your data is to be reused properly, and ideally also by researchers in different areas, and perhaps have more impact. So tip number 5 is, wherever they exist, you should use standardized terms and vocabularies in your metadata, and make explicit which ones you used, so that people and machines can make sense of what your data is about, or at least know where to find the answers. Our dataset is a good example of this. It describes how data parameters were constructed. In this case, how the term azimuth is used. To define azimuth, metadata goes the extra mile and refers to quantities, units, dimensions, and types, which is an established terminology standard that may be familiar to the STEM researchers in the room. So this way, the users not just know what descriptive units were used for the data, but also the epistemological assumptions that may lie beneath, if they're not straightforward. Apart from these metadata elements and markup, many researchers also still include a data description document entirely meant for human readers. This documentation is also fundamental to your dataset's ability to be reused, because users are more likely to reuse data that they understand, how it was created, what types of method, what types of analysis went into producing. So, as I've tried to show throughout this presentation, a lot of the work to make datasets discoverable and reusable is done by the infrastructure, not researchers directly, although there's a lot you can do. And one of the things you can do is choose your repositories well. Ideally, you will deposit in a mature, specialized subject repository that has the services that matter to you and your discipline, that is well connected to the global discovery infrastructure. And well, Pangea is one example of this, but there are many others. It's not an ad for Pangea, but they are a WDS member and certified through Core Trust Seal, which is an international certification agency for data repositories, in the creation of which WDS has also been involved, or directly involved. Among the requirements to become certified repositories have to give evidence that they enable data discovery and data reuse through many of the functions that we have presented today. And there's also a new certification cohort that just was announced by Andrew Portage, who will be seeking certification this year and getting support with material and mediational and knowledge to get there. So that might be an interesting thing to look at, considering our audience today. In addition to Core Trust Seal, you can find more repositories as well as other discovery and aggregation platforms in these service registries, such as Refidata, the European Open Science Cloud Marketplace, and Scientific Data's recommended repository list, which is used by Springer Nature and many others. The World Data System, or ITO, has also been working on a searchable index of metadata aggregators, which isn't published yet, but it will be available soon on Zenodo. So the next step is related to semantic metadata, which some of you may have heard about. Among the things to look for in repositories is whether they are enhancing metadata records, like landing pages, like the ones we showed you today, with semantic markup, prominently with schema.org. Schema.org is an emerging, though yet not fully developed, community-driven approach to machine-readable markup, among which support for research data metadata is growing. In principle, it will be more granular and specific, mainly to allow research software, as well as research management infrastructure, to search and retrieve more specific and precise results, but also to visualize the meaningful semantic connections between research outputs, researchers, and other semantic entities. For example, Pangea and also Dataset has some basic schema tags. It's the blue tags that are prefixed with the @ sign. In fact, it may well be the reason why datasets were picked up from multiple sources by Google. So to know more, I would encourage you to check out some of WDS ITO's resources on schema.org, including a Portage webinar that my coworker Chantal Very gave last year. Also, an upcoming publication introducing schema.org to research data managers, and the schema crosswalks visualization, which can show you how RDM metadata can be translated into other metadata standards, such as DataSite, Dublin Core, etc. So before we go into a round of questions, to conclude, while curating and depositing a well-documented depositing a well-documented data set is increasingly becoming a funding, publishing, and institutional requirement for researchers. I hope this presentation has been able to show you why it matters to go the extra mile and perhaps provide more metadata and documentation than that which is strictly mandatory, as there are direct benefits to you from good research data management practices and also to research. For more information, you can always reach out to your institutional librarians. They are there to help. My email address is also available to you for any questions you might have about this presentation. And at this point, I would just like to open the floor to any of your questions.
Thanks so much, Alicia and Kelly. And yes, the floor is now open for questions. If you have questions, you can use the raise hand function and ask them that way, or you can put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer them that way.
Hey, Jen, it looks like we do actually have a question in the Q&A that is under the answered category, but does not have an answer. It was a follow-up question for Kelly. Asking,
right.
Is there a list of minimum elements available somewhere for further?
It's a good question. I don't know that we have it published somewhere for what the minimum is for the discovery service. If you look at any record, I believe even the empty elements will show up as blank, but I can also find, if you're interested, the database schema link in the repository for you in GitHub. So I can drop that in the Q&A.
So, and just to follow up for those who might not have looked at the Q&A, the original question was, do you show the same metadata fields for each resource, or is it different based on what was published by the main repository?
Yeah, and the answer to that initial question is that it is the same for each resource. I didn't go too much into this in this presentation, but a lot of what the Harvester is doing is crosswalking that metadata from the source repository that's in various different schemas to this common, very generic schema that's mostly Dublin Core and DataSite elements. So there's some metadata that gets dropped in that process, and there's some elements that we have that source repository won't have, but the way the discovery service is built is on harmonizing all of this metadata.
Great, thanks so much.
Oh, I think I just lost my connection. No.
Oh, you're still there.
Okay.
I'm going to go down to, there's one that I just have to get my brain around translating here, Emma. I'll get back to that in just a second.
Mm-hmm.
But we have a question here about what recommendations on, if you have any recommendations on what metadata fields can be implemented for different domains or fields.
That's a very good question. Would you like to take that, Kelly, while I search for some resources to share? Or is there something?
I was thinking it would be better to take that question, yeah.
Well, so it's a very good question. So sorry, I think I'm maybe thinking about the wrong one. Could you repeat the one that you were referring to? Because I feel like one just disappeared. There was a question about the metadata fields implemented for different domain fields. Is that the one we're answering? Yes. Yeah, okay, good. So there is actually, there are a couple of resources with registries of vocabularies. And if you give me 1 second, I can point you to that resource. There's definitely the, thank you, the DCC list, and there's an RDA community curated list of specific metadata standards for different disciplines. But there's another that I found for vocabularies, just control vocabularies, which is also you know, an important part of using standards for metadata. So yes, those exist. I hope that answers the question. Thank you for the link.
Great, thank you. So getting back to Emma's question, she was hoping for some tips on how librarians can help researchers with metadata, and how they can help them work with different metadata repositories in practice, if you have thoughts on that. So if you were a librarian and a researcher came to you saying, I want to deposit this, I need to deposit it, I want it to be found, what should I do? What would you tell them?
I think I'd ask them whether they have heard or are aware of any researchers in their area who are depositing, just to find out where they are they depositing, and where they are searching for their data, and see and have a look together at how those practices are being, you know, how that is being practiced in their domain, and try to suss out, you know, looking at the metadata and maybe showing them, hey, you can look into the code and see maybe what's been done there, just as easily, you know, going into the JSON LD and trying to kind of explain it to them, or, you know, at least introduce them to the fact that it's not that hard to read if you already know what's behind it, and translate, you know, a bit what the schemas entail, and go from there. And then search for the resources and the repositories and so on that they might be interested in providing their data to. Look at the institutional policies that might exist, that might be in place, any constraints that they may have as to where and how they should be depositing the data. Look at what publications they want to publish with, because often those also have their own suggestions as to where they should be depositing and how. And as soon as they know where they would want to be depositing, ideally a repository that is mature and certified, ideally also, and implementing all these and more, ideally. The repositories themselves offer mostly good guidance. I mean, the bigger ones for sure. Documentation that you can look up, or ask your librarian for support, because we usually know how to find those things fairly quickly. We looked them up before, and yeah, and if anything else fails, I mean, they're coming to you. I would say go to your librarian, but yeah, we would definitely try to guide you through that process. Absolutely.
So it sounds from what you're saying like examples might be good. I'm wondering, maybe and Alicia or Kelly or other folks, and say, you know, if kind of a demonstration like we did of the kinds of how metadata can get you to different papers. So if people maybe have a paper that they know that's in a repository, showing them through searching how putting in different metadata can get them to things in different ways.
And also,
does that make sense?
Yeah, I felt like answering that question, I felt really, this is a question for the audience. What would you know, the researchers in the room want to hear from us when they are in that situation.
That's great. I mean, if there's anybody who has a story they'd like to share about things that have worked for them, you can put it into the chat or into the Q&A, and we can share it out. Asking the big questions here. That's right. That's what we're all about here, is the big questions. While you're thinking of that, thinking back to those reference interviews you had where you're like, oh, how do I answer this? We'll go to a question from Isabelle Laplante. Is there one meta tool that searches the most metadata sets? OpenAir or Google or Datasite?
That's a really great question. So I think it depends is the short answer, and the long answer is it depends on like kind of what you're looking for and what search tools you want to have for it. So Datasite would probably not be the most, because Datasite search would just be data sets that have, or research outputs that have DOIs registered with Datasite. With the new Datasite Commons, it's also including some Crossref DOIs. It's starting to pull those in, but it is limited to those 2 registration agencies. So you won't get anything without a DOI there. OpenAir pulls from Datasite as well as many other repositories and aggregators. But the metadata is fairly limited there, right? Like you can only see that description, keywords, the kind of more basic elements for a lot of things. So if you wanted to have a more detailed search, go to Further if you're looking for Canadian data sets. And one question I've gotten before is, if you're looking to search in Scholars Portal Dataverse, is it better to search in Scholars Portal itself or in Further? And if you want more detail, go to Scholars Portal, where you have the full metadata as it was originally deposited in Dataverse, and you can use all of the facets and things that they have. But if you want to get that alongside other research data sets, then Further is a better choice. So as far as the quick answer for the most, I'm probably OpenAir, maybe Google, because they're scraping so much, but they may have less detail. I'm not sure.
Can I just add to that, just to merge the questions in one, but it's a really good point that, so to go back to the question of what we would suggest to researchers, the recommendation is always to deposit as subject specifically as possible. So ideally you deposit at a mature, etc., good subject discipline repository, which is then well connected, right? Harvested by aggregation services. So the information you will get is probably going to be more specific in these smaller scale sort of, specific infrastructures, right? Which will be piped up. So the question is whether you want to go for breadth and find multiple resources from multiple different disciplines. And in that case, I would go probably to dataset search, although it does not cover as much as one would like. And certainly higher level general usually national projects like OpenAir, which is it's not a national, it's supranational, but it's European, right? It's a European project that is harvesting metadata worldwide. They are not restricted just to research data in Europe or by Europeans. They are harvesting, Canadian data as well. Yeah, sorry, but that's basically, they will be more general, but if you're looking for more specifics, for now, it might make sense to continue to search in those specific repositories and aggregators.
Great, thanks so much. This might be our last question, and it is a big one. We are coming up towards the hour, or the half hour in Newfoundland. Vanessa asks, are there resources or guidelines addressing privacy issues when generating metadata documentation? I ask this question because I'm collecting data from minors and I'd like to make my research available to laypersons. And Alicia and Kelly, we also have our privacy coordinator for Portage on the call, Victoria Smith. So if you would like her to jump in as well.
That would be amazing. Thank you.
I would love Victoria's take.
Yes.
All right, let me just unmute Victoria here. Allowed to talk.
Hello, can you hear me?
You're a bit quiet.
Is this better?
That is better.
Excellent. So thank you for this really fantastic question. And I wish I could say, yes, here you go, here's precisely what to do. But it's unfortunately a bit more nuanced. The first thing that I would say is, in order to share that data, you'll want to be sure that the consent information provided to your participants is explicit about the proposed data sharing. So you'll want to make sure that your consent form has a section that states that the data collected for the study will be shared with other researchers, and you can get specific there. You can say that it'll be shared broadly, it will be published openly, and you can speak a bit to how it will be de-identified to protect participant privacy. But what you absolutely need is their explicit consent for that proposed data sharing. Where it's with minors, I assume you've probably got a consent form for parents or guardians to sign and an assent form for minors. So you'd want to see that data sharing or future use language contained in both those documents. The sensitive data expert group created one part of their toolkit is designed around this issue. It's around consent language that's conducive to data sharing and data deposit. So I strongly recommend that you check that that guidance document if you're not already familiar, and find language in there that you can adopt or adapt for your study. It sounds from the question that you're already collecting data, and if that's the case, you can reconsent your participants with additional consent language around data sharing. So if you're hearing my response and thinking, oh goodness, that would have been great information to have a month ago or 5 months ago, don't fret too much. If you're still in contact with your participants, you can reconsent them on that issue. That being said, that's all around what you need to do to share the data legitimately. With regard to metadata, this is not my area of expertise. I'm becoming more familiar with metadata schemas for sensitive data, largely due to Kelly, who has been sharing them with me. They're great at that, at finding those resources. So thank you, Kelly. My concern there would largely be to make sure that the information contained in the metadata would not inadvertently increase the risk of re-identification or otherwise disclose information that could increase the sensitivity of the data or increase risk for your participants. So I wouldn't be able to point to a specific sensitive data metadata schema that I prefer over any others, but I would suggest that in choosing one and in choosing how you frame that metadata, how you fill that out, give some serious thought to anything that could be identifying, so sort of indirect identifiers like geography, or other things that could sort of pinpoint your study population. So especially if you're dealing with a complete cohort of some kind, so everyone that sort of fits a set of variables would be included. You want to be really careful in terms of what you disclose in that context. I hope that's helpful.
That is awesome, Victoria. Thank you so much. So we're just about a minute before the top or the bottom of the hour, depending on where you are. So I think this is probably a good time to wrap things up. And for me to thank our presenters, Alicia and Kelly, and thanks to Victoria as well. And thanks to all of you for being here. We do have a survey that we've put a link for in the chat, if you could fill that out. And I will be sharing a link to the video and to the slides in a little bit. We're just doing some Endrio YouTube stuff and should be getting these things up soon. And Alicia, did you have one last thing you wanted to say before we head out?
I did. Thank you. I did. Just on behalf of Jeff Moon and Portage, I wanted to share this call for application that is due. Deadline for is this Friday to apply for funding.
I think it's moved to next Friday.
It's moved. Perfect. 28th of May then. To curate COVID-19 data. This funding is open to Canadian researchers and research programs that are working and curating COVID-19 data. So please have a look if that's what you're doing. And yeah, if you have any questions, I guess, email Portage. Anybody at Portage? Jeff Moon at Portage? Or...
Yep, absolutely. And yes, we will be sending out the presentation along with the link to the video very soon.
And thank you, everybody. And thank you, Jen and Kelly, for being here today. And
thanks, everyone. We'll see you again soon. Have a great rest of your day.